Today, we explore the life of a figure as complex as he is infamous, Louis Wetzel. Renowned for his unmatched skill on the frontier and a rifle that seemed perpetually loaded, Wetzel's ruthless campaign against Native Americans made him a hero among his peers, yet a deeply unsettling figure by modern standards. He embodied both the resilience and brutality of early American expansion, a man whose legacy is steeped in both admiration and horror. His story unfolds in the rugged and volatile northern Ohio River Valley of the late 18th century, a time of ceaseless conflict and shifting borders. Born in 1763, the same year King George III issued the Proclamation of 1763, barring colonial settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains to preserve native lands. Wetzel grew up in a world where such restrictions were largely ignored. To settlers, the lands of Ohio and West Virginia were not forbidden territory, but prime locations for new beginnings. However, these lands were neither empty nor lawlessly open for the taking. They were home to numerous indigenous tribes, particularly the Shawnee, who fiercely resisted encroachment upon their ancestral territory. Wetzel's family was among the earliest to defy the British mandate, settling in 1770 near what is now Wheeling, West Virginia, along the eastern banks of the Ohio River. This river soon became both a symbolic and literal frontier. On one side, American settlers seeking expansion. On the other, native nations like the Shawnee defending their land from invasion. Tensions simmered constantly, erupting into outright conflict with the onset of the American Revolution in 1775. A war-torn youth as revolution consumed the colonies. Native American tribes largely aligned with the British, who at least made nominal efforts to protect indigenous land claims. For settlers in Wheeling, this meant an escalation of violent raids, fueling an already volatile enmity. But Wheeling was no mere victim of frontier warfare. Settler militias launched brutal attacks of their own, culminating in the 1778 murder of Chief Cornstalk, a respected Shawnee leader who had once sought peace. His assassination enraged the Shawnee and intensified a cycle of bloodshed that would shape Wetzel's worldview. By 1778, the war had reached the doorstep of a young Louis Wetzel. That year, at the age of 14, he and his younger brother were working on their family's farm when a group of native warriors emerged from the treeline. Sensing danger, Wetzel instinctively reached for his father's rifle, an act of caution that would prove crucial. A native warrior fired, grazing Wetzel's chest and wounding him, but not disabling him. The brothers were quickly captured and taken across the Ohio River. For 2 nights, they endured captivity, uncertain of their fate, execution, torture, or perhaps even adoption into the tribe, a common but terrifying prospect for captives of the time. On the second night, they made a daring escape. Not only did Wetzel slip free of his restraints, but he also crept back into the camp to retrieve his father's rifle and a pair of moccasins before fleeing into the wilderness. Their safe return stunned the Wheeling settlement, which had presumed them lost. This harrowing ordeal left an indelible mark on Wetzel, solidifying his hatred of Native Americans, a hatred that would soon turn deadly. A taste for violence by age 15, Wetzel had already begun seeking vengeance. When local frontiersmen sought his help in retrieving stolen horses allegedly taken by a native group, he did not hesitate. In the pursuit, Wetzel found himself alone and outnumbered by 2 native warriors. Thinking quickly, he used a trick he would later become known for, holding his hat out from behind a tree to lure his enemies into firing prematurely. When they took the bait, he struck, killing both men and scalping them. The act was not just a grisly trophy-taking. It was an accepted practice on the frontier, one that governments at times incentivized with bounties. One such bounty earned Wetzel a $100 reward for a slain native warrior, money he reportedly gave to a young woman he admired so she could purchase household items. But this act of supposed gallantry did nothing to temper his growing bloodlust. By 17, he had joined local militias as a scout, tracking native movements, ambushing warriors, and defending settlements. Scouts were unpaid and expected to provide their own weapons. Yet for Wetzel, this was more than duty. It was an obsession. A fearsome reputation physically, Wetzel was an imposing figure. Standing nearly 6 feet tall, he possessed a muscular build and an air of menace. His most striking feature, however, was his long, dark hair, which he never cut. It reached nearly to his calves when brushed out, both a mark of defiance and a grim symbol of his belief that one day he would be scalped by an enemy warrior. Yet what truly cemented his legend was his unparalleled skill in battle. In an era when muzzle-loading rifles required multiple steps to reload, Wetzel mastered the near-impossible feat of reloading while running, a skill that became his signature. During the ill-fated 1782 expedition led by Colonel William Crawford into Ohio Territory, a mission meant to destroy native villages as a deterrent, Wetzel's ability likely saved his life. The campaign ended in disaster, with Crawford and many of his men captured and executed. Wetzel, however, managed to escape. While retreating with a companion, John Mills, they were ambushed. Mills was killed instantly, leaving Wetzel alone and pursued. Yet, despite being outnumbered, he managed to kill one attacker before sprinting through the forest, reloading on the move. His relentless firing gave the illusion of an endless supply of ammunition, causing his pursuers to hesitate in disbelief. The phrase "his gun always loaded" became a refrain in frontier folklore, securing his mythic status. A life consumed by hatred, Wetzel's war against Native Americans did not end with the Revolution. His vendetta was deeply personal, fueled by repeated family tragedies. In 1786, his father, John Wetzel, and his brother George were killed in an ambush on the Ohio River, along with the family's dog. Later, that year, his sister Christina was also slain in a raid. These losses further unshackled Wetzel from any remaining moral restraint. No longer content with defending settlements, he took to hunting Native Americans indiscriminately. He murdered men in their sleep, snuck into camps at night to execute unarmed warriors, and took pride in his efficiency. On one occasion, he and his companion, Jonathan Zane, tracked down and killed 5 Shawnee men, scalping them as if collecting trophies. Unlike other frontiersmen, such as Simon Kenton, who reportedly felt remorse after killing a subdued enemy, Wetzel never wavered. To him, Native Americans were not human adversaries, but an enemy to be exterminated. Legacy of a killer by the early 19th century, as the frontier hardened and law began to take hold, men like Wetzel found themselves increasingly at odds with the society they had helped shape. His brand of frontier justice, once lauded, began to be seen as excessive, even criminal. He spent time in jail for unlawful killings, but was ultimately released due to his enduring popularity among settlers. Lewis Wetzel died in 1808, a man out of step with a world that had moved on from his kind of warfare. His legend persists told in folk tales and frontier songs, but his true legacy is one of unrelenting violence. A hero to some, a monster to others, Wetzel remains a symbol of the raw, brutal contradictions at the heart of early American expansion. Lewis Wetzel. The frontier's most controversial legend, Lewis Wetzel's ruthless pursuit of vengeance, set him apart as one of the most infamous figures of the American frontier. His reputation crossed boundaries, stirring both admiration and deep controversy. Between 1779 and 1788, historian James P. Pierce estimates that Wetzel was responsible for at least 27 Native American deaths, though other accounts claim he killed more than 100. The stock of his rifle reportedly bore over 20 notches, each believed to represent a life he had taken. Despite his mounting death toll, Wetzel faced little to no consequences for his actions, at least not initially. Defying military orders and facing arrest by 1788, Wetzel's relentless violence had finally drawn the attention of military authorities at Fort Harmar in Marietta, Ohio. General Josiah Harmar, tasked with maintaining fragile peace negotiations with the Seneca chief Tecumseh, ordered Wetzel to stay away, fearing the volatile scout might jeopardize diplomatic efforts. However, Wetzel defied the order, ignoring Harmar's warnings. Wetzel ambushed Tagunda along the road, shooting and scalping him. Although the chief initially survived and identified Wetzel as his attacker, Wetzel remained unrepentant. His actions were not rooted in strategic warfare, but in an unwavering personal hatred for all Native Americans. The incident caused an uproar, prompting Harmar to order Wetzel's arrest, one of the few times he ever faced legal consequences for his actions. Yet, even in captivity, Wetzel remained a divisive figure. Many settlers viewed him as a hero who had taken justice into his own hands, reflecting their own frustrations and fears about the volatile frontier. His supporters soon took matters into their own hands, breaking him out of jail and ensuring no formal trial ever took place. After this episode, Wetzel disappeared for a time, evading further scrutiny. In the eyes of the law, he became nearly untouchable. A folk hero and a divisive symbol, the incident at Fort Harmar deepened the divide in public opinion. To many settlers, Wetzel was a symbol of frontier toughness, a man who fought against what they perceived as a constant threat. His legend grew, spreading through songs, tales, and artwork, elevating him to the status of a folk hero akin to Daniel Boone or Simon Kenton. But unlike Boone, who valued diplomacy, or Kenton, who often expressed remorse for his actions, Wetzel was driven purely by revenge. Historians often cite Wetzel as an embodiment of the violent cycles that defined frontier life, where raids, counter-raids, and blood feuds ensured that peace remained elusive. His story reveals the moral ambiguity of the era. Settlers, often victims of Native attacks, saw Wetzel's violence as justified. Native Americans, facing relentless displacement and slaughter, viewed him as a harbinger of settler cruelty and land theft. For the Shawnee, Delaware, and other indigenous nations of the Ohio Valley, Wetzel was not just a killer, but a representation of the settlers' disregard for Native sovereignty and life. His actions were part of a broader pattern of frontier warfare that decimated Native populations, disrupted entire communities, and left deep scars on both sides of the conflict. The decline of a relic from a violent era as Wetzel aged, his notoriety continued to precede him, but the landscape of the frontier was changing. By the early 1790s, the wilderness was giving way to structured settlements, and federal authorities were attempting to establish more stable relations with Native nations. The era of unchecked violence was waning, and figures like Wetzel, who had thrived in lawlessness, found themselves increasingly at odds with the new order. Without an ongoing war to fuel his personal vendetta, Wetzel struggled to find purpose. By 1791, he drifted westward, seeking new opportunities in Louisiana, then under Spanish control. He briefly enlisted in military efforts against Spanish forces, but his reputation as an unrelenting Indian killer followed him, making integration into structured society difficult. The violence that had once defined his life no longer had a place in the evolving frontier. Final years and death in his later years, Wetzel's health declined, and accounts suggest he suffered from both physical ailments and a troubled mind, perhaps haunted by the countless lives he had taken. His impulsive nature and history of extreme violence left lasting effects on his psyche. By the mid-1790s, Wetzel had traveled to the Spanish-controlled Louisiana Territory, possibly hoping to escape his past. However, his reputation made it difficult to outrun the shadow of his former life. He briefly served in local militias, but never regained the notoriety or satisfaction he once had on the Ohio frontier. By 1808, Wetzel's body had weakened, and he had become a solitary figure, far from the settlements that once celebrated him. He died at the age of 45 in Natchez, Mississippi, alone and largely forgotten. His burial was a quiet affair, his grave left unmarked, as if history itself sought to erase or soften the impact of his brutal legacy. The controversial legacy of Louis Wetzel today. Louis Wetzel remains one of the most polarizing figures of early American history. To some, he is remembered as a hero of the frontier, a man who defended settlers from attacks and embodied the rugged individualism of early America. To others, he is emblematic of the darkest aspects of frontier violence, a man consumed by hatred who perpetuated cycles of bloodshed without remorse. His story serves as a reminder of the brutal realities of frontier life and the deep moral complexities that define the struggle for control over the American wilderness. Whether viewed as a fearless defender or a ruthless killer, Wetzel's legacy is inextricably tied to the violent and tragic history of westward expansion. Lewis Wetzel. The dark legend of the American frontier, his exploits became the stuff of legend, immortalized in frontier folklore, ballads, and even early novels. Wetzel was often depicted as a fearless and uncompromising defender of the wilderness, a hero standing against the perceived chaos of the untamed frontier. Generations of settlers sang songs celebrating the deeds of Indian fighters, and Wetzel's name became woven into the mythology of early America, akin to Paul Bunyan or Davy Crockett, though his story carried a far darker and bloodier undertone. Yet modern historians take a far more critical view. Rather than a hero, they see Wetzel as a tragic and deeply troubled figure, a man so consumed by hatred that he could not envision a world beyond violence. His relentless vendetta against Native Americans blinded him to any possibility of coexistence, leaving a legacy of destruction rather than diplomacy. His life serves as a stark warning about the corrosive power of vengeance and the devastating consequences of hatred unchecked. Wetzel's actions reflect the grim realities of the American frontier, a place where conflict between settlers and indigenous peoples was constant, merciless, and defined by cycles of brutality. His story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about America's past, the cost of expansion, the justification of violence, and the scars left on all those who took part in the battle for control over the land. A legacy of blood and retribution figures like Wetzel compel us to recognize the heavy toll of westward expansion, not only on Native Americans, but also on those who carried out the violence. The settlers, living in a world of relentless uncertainty and fear, became locked in cycles of retribution, where survival often meant adopting the same ruthlessness as their enemies. Men like Wetzel emerged as symbols of this hostility, both products of their time and agents of its darkest instincts. To some, he remains an emblem of courage, a man who embodied the frontier's unyielding resilience. To others, he is a stark reminder of the era's cruelty, a representation of how deeply embedded fear and animosity had become in the American psyche. His story remains one of the most controversial in frontier history, straddling the line between folklore and reality, heroism and horror. Lewis Wetzel in perspective. Ultimately, the life of Lewis Wetzel defies simple classification. He was a man forged by the unforgiving world of the frontier, a product of an era where violence was seen not only as a tool for survival, but as an inevitable part of existence. His actions, often indefensible, nevertheless shed light on a time when fear dictated choices, when vengeance became a way of life, and when a line between hero and villain was blurred by necessity. Wetzel's story embodies the harsh truths of early American expansion, where hope, fear, and hatred collided in a world that offered little mercy. His life serves as a cautionary tale about the perils of unchecked rage and the human cost of endless warfare. It also forces us to reckon with the legacy of frontier violence, not just in terms of the destruction it wrought upon Native Americans, but also in the way it shaped the settlers who carried it out. His name endures as a testament to the struggles, sacrifices, and brutal clashes that defined America's westward push. In remembering Wetzel, we are reminded of the human cost of history, a past defined by conquest, survival, and the unrelenting pursuit of vengeance.